inventions have reshaped human history as profoundly as the wheel. From the wagon and the bicycle to cars, trains and aeroplanes, the wheel revolutionized the transportation of goods and people. And its utility, of course, extends from the engineering of simple machines to the most complex. Without the wheel, modern life would be simply impossible. But for tens of thousands of years, societies across the world thrived perfectly well without it. The wheel wasn't an obvious invention, and its proper utilization required some relatively sophisticated engineering. For a long time, it was assumed that Mesopotamia, as the cradle of civilization, was the birthplace of the wheel. But over the last few decades, new discoveries in Europe have challenged this old assumption. So what people first utilized wheeled vehicles, and why were they useful? By examining all the different kinds of evidence, can we say when and where the wheel, and crucially the axle, was actually invented? And what impacts did the invention of the wheel have on these various ancient societies? This is the story of an apparently simple invention that changed the world. The invention of the wheel reshaped military history too, with developments like the Sumerian battle wagon and the Sintashta war chariot. But it wasn't until the invention of the internal combustion engine that wheeled vehicles became truly dominant on the battlefield. And you can experience not only epic land battles spanning an entire century, but also air and naval combat thanks to this video's sponsor, War Thunder. War Thunder is a free-to-play, large-scale multiplayer military action game where ground vehicles, aircraft and naval vessels fight in dynamic battles at locations around the world. Players can use advanced tech like guided missiles, night vision systems, active protection, drones, and even a devastating nuclear strike. Vehicles can be upgraded with modules and customized with skins to make each one unique. And now, following the recent update Task Force, graphics and physics have once again been significantly enhanced. Destruction and explosions are now even more immersive and realistic. New long-awaited vehicles have been included, like the BM Opot-T tank, the Buk M3 SAM system, as well as Hornet fighters and many other machines. And fan-favourite maps Poland and Eastern Europe have been completely reworked. Download War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation and Xbox by using the link in the description. All new players and those who haven't played War Thunder for half a year or more will receive some special bonuses, 100,000 Silver Lions, a special decorator Eagle of Valor and more. And you can also fully immerse yourself in exciting battles in War Thunder Mobile, an epic mobile multiplayer action game. Download and play it for free on iOS or Android using the link in the description. Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring the video. For almost all of human history, of course, we didn't use the wheel. Our ancestors did perfectly well carrying things in baskets and bags, suspended them on poles, and dragged them on frames and sleds. Famously, North Americans used dragged frames we call travois, pulled by people, dogs and horses. A recent paper suggests this technology was in use perhaps 22,000 years ago, and surely people were doing this kind of thing around the world in the Paleolithic. The most common prehistoric vehicle is surely the boat, which has carried people and their belongings along rivers and coasts, and even across open seas, for hundreds of thousands of years. And once cattle were domesticated, some people began using them to pull things. A life of heavy pulling leaves detectable changes in the bones of cattle, and for decades now, experts have been examining prehistoric cattle bones for these signs. One paper I saw recently found evidence that domestic cattle in Neolithic Ireland were being used for animal traction before 3000 BC. There's no direct evidence for wheeled vehicles there at that time, but it seems likely they were using oxen to pull heavy loads. And it may be that animal traction, with or without wheeled vehicles, enabled the construction of the many megalithic monuments in Ireland. Perhaps the same is true for monuments in Neolithic Britain, like Stonehenge. You often see reconstructions of megalithic stones on frames, with sled runners or on logs being used as rollers, being dragged by teams of people. but it's likely oxen were also used for this pulling, and although we have no evidence yet, it's possible wheels and wagons were involved too. There is evidence for sledges in the form of ceramic models from Neolithic and Chalcolithic Eastern Europe. These societies, as far back as 6000 BC, made many small ceramic models of the important things in their lives, most famously perhaps their female figurines. But they also made models of their houses and temples, and model furniture and model pottery and ovens. Sometimes these things could be highly stylized and incorporated metaphysical or mythical elements, like a goddess or something incorporated into a house. As well as people, they also made ceramic models of important animals, like birds and especially cattle. All these models were related to their religious practices. You can imagine leaving a little ceramic bull on your altar, perhaps symbolizing an offering, or maybe taking the form of the thing you wanted, fertile cattle, or a healthy pregnancy, and so on. And some researchers think children might have played with them too. I really like the idea of Chalcolithic kids playing with toy kitchens 7,000 years ago. The Cucuteni Tripilia culture also made models of sledges, high-sided vehicles with runners on the bottom. Sometimes these models incorporated one or two oxen on the front, as if pulling the vessel they were part of. These objects, often found in houses along with other models, are more like bowls evoking the shape of a sledge, rather than a real-life replica of one. But presumably they reflect real-life technology employed to carry loads locally and perhaps over longer distances. The real-life sledges were perhaps developed after about 4000 BC, when groups moved westwards from the Carpathian foothills across the river valleys to the east, building sometimes enormous settlements. They also carried out long-range trade between settlements and with regions beyond. Most of the sledge models examined in one study suggest they date to between about 3800 and 3650 BC, at which point this society suffered a period of terminal decline. And it's likely this period, between 3950 and 3650 BC, was when they made a famous ceramic model of an ox on 4 wheels, which was found in Cherkasska Oblast, Ukraine. We can't be very precise with the dating, but this might be the oldest known wheeled object in the world. Obviously, it's not a wagon. But we know the artistic tradition of these people included things along these lines, where they'd combine an ox and a cart into one object. So maybe it does represent the idea of a wagon being pulled by an ox, and reflect something that had been invented and was in use. But just because someone made a model with wheels doesn't mean they had full-size wheeled wagons. After all, Mesoamericans had wheeled models without ever developing full-size wheeled wagons, as far as we know. So maybe this Cucuteni Tripilia wheeled ox is the earliest abstract evidence for a wheeled ox-drawn wagon, or maybe it's just a ritual object or a child's toy. I like it because, just like many other objects from this society, it demonstrates a certain sense of humour. Not that things like this were a joke, exactly, although maybe they did think this was funny, but they had this kind of amusing wittiness, I guess. But the earliest evidence for actual full-sized wheeled vehicles anywhere in the world comes from a site in northern Germany, almost 1,000 miles away. When archaeologists excavated a Neolithic burial monument near Flintbek, they found, sealed beneath the stones and earth, on the ancient ground surface, a set of wheel tracks. Careful examination of these deep parallel marks showed they were made by wheels, with the earth compressed by the weight of the vehicle, not dragged by runners. After they were made, the grooves were soon filled with blown soil, and a portion of the monument erected on top sealed them for thousands of years. Radiocarbon dating shows that these tracks were made between 3420 and 3385 BC, so say around 3400 BC. This monument and the tracks were made by the people of the funnel-beaker culture. This is classified as a Neolithic culture, although they did also do some metalworking. Perhaps it's surprising, that the earliest evidence for the wheel anywhere in the world is up here, so far from the centres of civilization. But these people were capable of great feats of engineering and craft. They erected thousands of megalithic monuments, many of which still stand today, and they made beautiful, fine ceramics. Most of the things they made would have been crafted from timber, almost all of which has long since rotted away, from their large houses to their tools and weapons. Timber was an abundant resource in temperate Europe, and so it makes sense that the people who had lived here for thousands of years would be amongst the world's best carpenters, capable of making something as challenging as functional wheels and the necessary axles and wagons they had to function with. The wagons they used might have been used in agriculture, land clearances, fuel and timber collection, and in transporting resources. The Flintbek monument was itself perhaps on a wagon trackway on the high ground leading to the nearby fjord and the Baltic Sea beyond. So it's a pretty fair bet to say wheeled vehicles were in use in Northern Europe by 3400 BC. And there's another funnel-beaker site in Poland near Bronocice, where there was an unusually large Neolithic settlement covering 52 hectares, that's 130 acres. There was found a ceramic pot decorated with the image of a four-wheeled wagon that's even got the yoke part at the front for the team of oxen. It was found in a pit with a cattle bone, and that cattle bone was radiocarbon dated to an average of about 3500 BC. Obviously that's dating by association rather than directly, and the surrounding settlement around the pit tended to give dates averaging more like 3350 BC. So it's likely the four-wheeled wagon was in use here between about 3500 and 3350 BC, which aligns with the date from Flintbek. There is also evidence from the region in the form of artwork on a megalithic tomb that was built at a similar time. The artwork on the stones is said to include images of wagons, but they can't say for sure the artwork was made when the tomb was built rather than later, so I don't see it as strong evidence. However, it does add to the general weight of evidence from Northern Europe for wagon use at this time. Undeniable evidence, however, in the form of the oldest securely dated wooden wheel and axle in the world was found in Slovenia. Radiocarbon dating shows these artefacts are from between 3350 and 3100 BC. The settlements around the Alps at this time were often built on lake shores, and in some places the mud of the lakes preserved wooden objects until today. The Ljubljana Marshes wheel and axle managed to remain in an anaerobic environment for over 5,000 years until they were found. The wheel is just 72 centimeters in diameter and made of ash, while the 124 centimeter long axle is made of oak. The axle rotated together with the wheels. The wheel was made with two planks of wood held together with cross braces. Because they're so small, they were likely used on a two-wheeled hand cart. Looking at the original and the museum reconstruction, you can get a sense of the carpentry skills necessary to create a usable cart or wagon. The woodwork had to be precise and sturdy for it to be functional. It's likely these tricky technical issues that limited the development of the wagon for so long. Neolithic people had been making spindle whorls from stone and clay for spinning yarn for thousands of years. These were fixed onto wooden shafts, so something like little wheels and axles were everyday items and had been for a long time. But scaling up a concept like that into a vehicle meant solving the problem of housing an axle to a wagon bed so that it could rotate with the wheel, or fixing the axle so the wheel could rotate around it. These things had to be precisely made with just the right amount of clearance, and they had to be strong but also not too heavy. It seems simple, but it was tricky to execute. Not far from Ljubljana, and at the same sort of time, the Chalcolithic Barden culture of Central and Southeast Europe was making ceramic models of wagons, the oldest of which are likely dated to about 3300 to 3100 BC. The Barden culture had links right across Southeast Europe and across into Anatolia, so it's one proposed route for spreading wagon and wheel technology either to or from the Near East. and these models have been cited in a hypothesis proposing the Carpathians as the place where the wheel was invented. This 2024 paper proposes that wheels were invented specifically in the Carpathians and specifically for supporting deep copper mining as early as 3900 BC. This paper got a huge amount of media attention, reporting this hypothesis as if it was a fact, or at least was well evidenced. And I noticed there are videos on YouTube likewise uncritically repeating the content of the paper as if it was accurate. In fact, this paper presents no new archaeological evidence at all. There is evidence for early wheels in the Carpathians in the form of the ceramic wagon models that look like drinking cups or mugs with handles. These wagon models do exist and were associated with some burials assigned to the Boleraz and the Barden cultures. This paper says the Boleraz culture starts around 3600 BC, and therefore the models are the oldest representations of the wheel in the world. In fact, though, their cited source contradicts this. That paper, titled Prehistoric Wagon Models in the Carpathian Basin 3500 to 1500 BC, says the Cucuteni Tripilia wheeled oxen model I talked about earlier likely dates to between about 3950 and 3650 BC, which makes it earlier than any of the Carpathian models. The Boleraz culture spans between about 3600 and 3300 BC, and the later Barden culture dates to about 3300 to 2700 BC. Really, the Boleraz culture is the initial horizon or phase of the Barden cultural complex, and most of the models of the Boleraz phase don't actually have wheels or even holes for axles either. Some of them do have integrated animals that could be pulling them, which could make them sledge models. However, these animals are considered to be dogs, rams, sheep, or bears rather than oxen. The few models with wheels mostly date to the Barden culture between 3300 and 3100 BC. This paper says the ceramic models likely depict small wicker baskets used to extract copper ore from mining tunnels. But their reasoning for this doesn't make any sense. The Barden culture, being relatively poor in copper, is taken as evidence they must have had to extract more ore, and this extra work led to the invention of wheels. There is no evidence at all for the existence of hypothetical mining carts in this era. They didn't have things that looked like 19th century mine carts. There's no evidence even for boxes on wooden rollers. Mining in the Chalcolithic era wasn't like that. There wasn't extensive underground mining along flat-bottomed tunnels. And in fact, the source they cite in the paper doesn't say these ceramic models were related to mining or copper production at all, and instead speculates that the association seems to be with sheep and wool production. The rest of the paper is then dedicated to computational analysis of the physics of wheels. To be clear, there is no evidence presented in this paper that wheels were invented in the Carpathians, no evidence that wagons were related to mining, and nothing to back up the assertion in the introduction that the invention dates to 3900 BC. The Carpathian models instead fit with the broader regional timeline of wheels and wagons being around in the second half of the 4th millennium BC, so after about 3500 BC. This timing is supported by circumstantial evidence too. It's likely the widespread use of the ox-drawn wagon in Central and Northern Europe after about 3500 BC contributed to changes in settlement patterns. Large settlements decline and small farmsteads grow more common. The population is more diffused across the landscape. It's thought that using a wagon to support agriculture might have made single-family farms more viable. And the globular amphora culture of Central Europe, dated to about 3400 to 2800 BC, started practicing sacrificial animal burials, including sacrificing teams of oxen. They likely embraced the wagon so much that it also transformed the nature of their society. I've been saying I'll make a dedicated video about this culture for years now, but I will do that soon, as they're very interesting and important. So please subscribe if you're interested in seeing a video like that. And at the same time, to the east, on the European steppe, a much more famous society was also embracing the wheel and the wagon. And we know this because they even began burying some special people with their vehicles. Sometime after about 3500 BC, burials of the Yamnaya culture began to include complete wagons. We know of over 250 wagon burials from the Yamnaya and catacomb culture eras. These were wagons, usually disassembled and buried in pit graves, with a person, along with other grave goods, sealed beneath earthen barrows or burial mounds. The earliest securely dated ones come from between about 3300 to 2800 BC. The earliest ones are likely from before 3000 BC. These wagon burials, of course, formed part of the mortuary rites for some special people. The tradition of burying people in or with vehicles would continue on the steppe and at various places across Europe for thousands of years. Sometimes wheels were placed in the four corners of the burial pit, as if making the grave itself into a wagon bed. The wagon was both a conveyance for the journey to the afterworld and presumably a prestige object for use in the next life. The inclusion of something as valuable as a wagon shows its importance in the lives of these people and these steppe herder societies. David Anthony argues in his popular book The Horse, the Wheel and Language that the development or the introduction of the ox-drawn wagon on the steppe transformed the societies there. Previously, the herding societies had been limited to settlements in the river valleys, but after about 3500 BC, these people began moving across the steppes with their herds, utilising the vast grasslands for their sheep and cattle, and bringing their shelter and water and whatever else they needed in their wagons for these seasonal migrations. We don't know whether they invented the wagon or if it was introduced from the west or if it was introduced across the Caucasus Mountains. But the wagon was fundamental to their way of life, and it became a symbol of status and identity, as well as being integrated into their spiritual beliefs. If it's true that the Yamnaya culture way of life, mobile seasonal herding on the steppes, was only possible thanks to ox-drawn wagons, that would date their use to the start of the Yamnaya period, which is perhaps as early as 3600 BC, almost certainly by 3300 BC, and thanks to radiocarbon dating actual wagon burials, certainly before 3000 BC. These steppe cultures were enormously successful, spreading their ways of life, technologies and languages from their homelands right across Eurasia. A catacomb culture expansion after 2500 BC probably brought the ancestral language to Armenian across the Caucasus. There's an incredible preserved wagon from Armenia dating to about 1500 BC, although others claim it's more like 2000 BC, that is rightly world famous. There were actually the remains of about 12 wagons discovered in elite burials at this site, and they give us an incredible insight into Bronze Age transportation technology. There are also a handful of wagon burials attributed to the late Mycop or Novosbornaya culture. These were beneath burial mounds on the Kuban steppe north of the Caucasus and the lower Volga steppe, hundreds of kilometers away from the Caucasus. These burials have not been radiocarbon dated, but are estimated to date between 3400 and 3000 BC. This is the same sort of time as the wagon burials from the Yamnaya culture. The late Mycop or Novosbornaya culture of the North Caucasus foothills is therefore a proposed route for the spread of wagon and wheel technology either to or from the steppe, and perhaps into or out of Mesopotamia. But without more precise dating, we can't say which way this went. People have also looked at linguistic evidence to better pinpoint the invention of the wheel and the wagon. Linguists have reconstructed the Proto-Indo-European word for wheel, which means the thing that turns or revolves. The etymology shows it was a word native to the Indo-European speaking steppe people. Often when a technology is introduced from a foreign society, the word for that foreign thing comes with it. So the fact that Proto-Indo-European speakers had their own native term for it has been taken as evidence for it being an invention of the steppe people. But it's not always the case that an imported technology brings its name with it, so it's not very strong evidence in my opinion. Lots of wagon-related English words can be traced back to these original wagon users actually. Not only the word wheel, but the word for yoke, which comes from the term to join or harness. There are also Proto-Indo-European words for axle, reins, and for the verb to go in a vehicle. Linguists are also able to track changes in words and sounds over time and project these changes backwards in time at steady rates, and so estimate when different language branches diverged. The only Indo-European language branch that might not have its own vehicle-related terms is Anatolian. So this might mean the Anatolian branch diverged before wheels were developed or adopted by Proto-Indo-European speakers. There's debates over this subject, of course, but the evidence suggests a separation sometime between 4000 BC and 3500 BC, which again aligns with the idea of the wheel arriving on the steppe around 3500 BC. But did it arrive from the farming societies of the West or from the civilizations of the South? As far back as the 19th century at least, and all the way to the 1980s, the wheel was assumed to have been developed in the Near East. There was a long tendency amongst Western antiquarians and early archaeologists that all the great inventions came from the famous civilizations of the region. They understood from the writings of the ancient Greeks and Romans the great antiquity and primacy of ancient Egypt. Even more so perhaps, they knew from the Bible the importance of Babylon and Mesopotamia to world history. And for a long time, in fact, there was still this broad understanding that the Holy Land was the centre of the world, or at least it had been once. The earliest archaeological campaigns in the region, in Egypt, Syria and Mesopotamia, confirmed that this region had given birth to civilization, developing the first sophisticated agriculture, the first cities, temples and palaces, and the first writing, and so on. So it was a pretty fair assumption that the wheeled vehicle was one of these inventions. And it seems likely the potter's wheel was an invention of ancient Sumer, coming about maybe after about 3500 BC. Slow-turning potter's wheels were probably used too, and some say these were also used by the Cucuteni Tripilia culture around the same sort of time. But the true potter's wheel was really a heavy flywheel in a frame, spinning quickly to aid in pottery making. The earliest surviving potter's wheel seems to be from about 3100 BC. And it would make sense if they transferred some of these potter's wheel principles to wheeled vehicles too. And there is indeed evidence for wheels and wagons in Mesopotamia at broadly the same time as the evidence from Europe, the late 4th millennium BC. The evidence is these depictions on clay tablets from the late Uruk period. These symbols look like little huts with two circles beneath. Some think the curving bit on the bottom is the runner for a sledge, but they might be a harness instead. There is some debate about whether these circles, instead of being wheels, are meant to indicate the number 2. So it might be conveying that there's 2 of whatever the symbols are, maybe structures or sledges. But if they are sledges, it's also possible the circles underneath are meant to be solid rollers rather than wheels. But if they are actually depicting wagons with wheels, then this is evidence for vehicles in the late 4th millennium BC in Mesopotamia. There's a debate over the exact absolute dating of the specific late Uruk phases, but recent radiocarbon dating suggests these images probably date to after 3300 BC. It's possible they could be earlier too, but not earlier than 3500 BC. And then in Sumer, after around 3000 BC, they develop signs and words, meaning wheeled vehicles. So, from Mesopotamia to Northern Europe, the evidence for the first existence of wheeled vehicles all points to roughly the same era, between about 3500 and 3000 BC. The wheel, axle and wagon spread very quickly. By 3000 BC, it was in use right across Europe and probably the Near East. By 2500 BC, this technology had reached the Indus Valley culture, and then China after about 2000 BC. These early wagons had solid disc wheels, but there were slight differences in designs in different regions and times. So it's clear that it was the wheel, axle and wagon concept that was being spread, and then adapted by local people. There were continuing innovations. On the steppe, the people of the catacomb culture between about 2500 and 2000 BC developed what's called a crossbar wheel. It's a design that removes mass and so makes the wheel lighter than a solid wheel. These kinds of wheels were still being used into the modern era. It's possible they did this for two-wheeled carts, making them light enough to be pulled by horses rather than oxen, because there's evidence that the catacomb culture developed the earliest kind of disc cheek pieces, special components on a horse harness for the control of horses. These cheek pieces were not used for riding horses and are clearly associated with the spread of chariots. The spoked wheel was an innovation associated with the war chariot, dating to about 2200 BC, and it was developed by the Abashevo or Sintashta culture. The spoked wheel was strong but light enough to be pulled by a pair of horses at high speed. This technology, spoked wheels, chariots, and a special horse breed to pull them, would soon spread across Eurasia in the early 2nd millennium BC. The chariot would of course revolutionise warfare, and for a few centuries was the pinnacle of military technology. But the original development of the wheel likely happened sometime around 3500 BC, and it spread so fast, relatively speaking, that it's not really possible to say for sure where it originated. The archaeological dating methods used on all the many forms of evidence, from 2D and 3D representations to actual surviving wheels and wagons, and the marks they made in the earth, are not precise enough to narrow it down any further. We can say at least that the earliest evidence for the time being comes from Northern Europe, and the next earliest evidence comes from Central and Eastern Europe, and also probably Mesopotamia. So it could have spread from north to south, and also from west to east. Or it's possible, I think, that it was developed in the Cucuteni Tripilia culture, from their ox-drawn sledges, and from there spread outwards to Northern Europe, across the steppe to the west, and down into the Near East. It would make a kind of sense that somewhere broadly central to the whole distribution was the starting point. The suggestion that coincidental, simultaneous invention happened in two places at once tends to be dismissed as cosmically unlikely, but stranger things have happened. I have no doubt at all that the brilliant and creative people of ancient Sumer could have developed wheeled vehicles independently, so maybe there were two centres of invention. Hopefully we'll get more evidence in future that will clarify the situation. But we do know this invention transformed agriculture and perhaps supported the construction of megalithic monuments. And in Eastern Europe, wagons enabled pastoral mobility on the steppe, completely transforming the societies there. And soon they facilitated trade, transport and warfare across Eurasia. Once the idea took hold, it reshaped the way humans moved, worked and fought forever, and helped ultimately to give birth to the modern world. To make videos like this, I take the time to read and understand the academic sources. In the books or papers on a subject, I look at the sources they use and then read them, and then look at their sources and so on. Doing all this takes time and money in book purchases and journal subscriptions, but it's important to me to represent the literature accurately and to understand it properly. If you appreciate this kind of work, then please support it by joining me on Patreon or as a YouTube channel member. For just a few dollars a month, you will get early access to ad-free videos and other exclusive content. Please join us using the links in the description below. If you can't support financially, then please do like, subscribe and share my videos. And for simply watching my videos, I appreciate every one of you enormously. Now, to find out more about how the wheel and wagons influenced an incredible ancient society, please watch this video on the catacomb culture of the Bronze Age steppe. Thank you for watching.